Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne Leon. Aaron Maté is here with us today to talk about OPCW, Russiagate, and Stephen Cohen. This is a fully independent podcast. Lend your support patreon.com/aroundtheempire or paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. Also, please like, share, and subscribe on YouTube. In our discussion today, we talk about the OPCW Whistleblowers, Jose Bustani, and Aaron's testimony at the UN. We also discuss recent developments in the Russiagate conspiracy and pay tribute to the great Stephen Cohen, prominent scholar, professor, and author. There's a bonus segment for patrons about who was behind the pressuring of the OPCW and for what purpose. That's episode 189 Extra, Relentless Pressure on OPCW. We recorded this on October 16th, 2020. Aaron Maté talking to us from New York. Hello, Aaron. Thanks so much for coming back on the show.
Thanks for having me.
So this is an ambitious goal that we have here, that I have, I should say. But I'd like to get the gist of some of the big stories that Aaron's been covering recently, and they are big. And what I'm going to do is we're not going to be able to get into a lot of detail. So I'm going to point you to some articles and pushback episodes to follow up where you can really, get a deep dive on this stuff. So the three things that the two really big topics are the Syria and the OPCW adventure that Aaron has been covering with OPCW whistleblowers about the alleged chemical weapons attacks alleged to be done by the Syrian government, and what has happened with OPCW since, and then what happened at the UN, where Aaron actually testified. And I also am obliged to follow up on Russiagate because there's a lot going on there. I personally have not been able to with it for as much as I used to over the last 2 months. It takes a real dedicated effort and a multi-source type thing to keep up with that. But there have been some kind of big developments I just wanted to go over with you. And then I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about Stephen Cohen. And we'll have a bonus question at the end, as usual, for patrons. And we're going to try to do all this in a half hour. And I don't know how we're going to do it, Aaron, but I have faith in you. I'm going to do very little talking. Let's put it that way. So you want to start out with Syria?
Whatever you want.
Okay. So I've been following your work on Syria and OPCW. And, I've been a long time skeptic about the official narrative on the chemical weapons attacks. And followed it in real time. And but Aaron and the Grayzone have been in touch with some brave OPCW whistleblowers who have some firsthand knowledge from the investigations they did, investigations that were later manipulated to fit the official narrative. And Aaron was called to testify at a recent UN Security Council meeting. And, Security Council is, it's another UN committee and all that, but it's a very, very powerful committee. This is basically where you have to go to get permission to wage war on somebody, right, Aaron?
Yeah, but Joanne, just one correction.
Sorry.
Well, I'm not going to speak to sources and who I've spoken to, but I wouldn't assume that I've been in touch with OPCW whistleblowers. I've gotten leaks from inside the OPCW, but I just wouldn't assume that I've been in touch with whistleblowers. I did get a direct statement from one OPCW official that I published earlier this year. This is someone who was not involved in the Duma investigation under discussion, but that person witnessed the mistreatment of the inspectors who were on the Duma investigation, and that person did, give me a statement which I published at the Grayzone. But aside from that, I would not.
Okay, so there's it's an arm's length type Yeah, you're getting the information.
I've gotten leaks. I've certainly gotten leaks, but I just, but it's, I wouldn't, there are people who've been identified who are known publicly, and I would not assume that I'm in touch with them. That's all
Gotcha.
I'm saying. Yeah.
No, thank you for that clarification.
Yeah.
Um, so there have been many different chemical weapons attacks um, over the past 8 years, let's say, of the Syrian war, but the focus has been on a couple of them. And the OPCW has investigated some of them, and they've issued reports, and that's the topic that we're talking about here. So, first of all, let's start with the most recent. How did you come to, give a statement and be at the UN Security Council meeting? I was shocked when I saw that. I didn't know this was coming. I was like, oh my God, he's at the UN Security Council meeting. How did that happen?
Well, just as a way of background, in the absence of any account of CW and a continued refusal to let the inspectors whose evidence was censored and who were sidelined from their own investigation, to let them come and air the evidence and to have some minimal transparency at the OPCW, there's been an effort to litigate this at the UN Security Council with Russia and China on one side, and the U.S., Britain, and France on the other side, because the OPCW itself has completely locked down the inspectors who went to Duma, who found evidence that this was not a chemical attack by the Syrian government, but in fact that this was staged by militants on the ground. They've been maligned by the OPCW, and the OPCW has refused to meet with them and to let them air their suppressed evidence in a transparent manner. So Russia and China have been trying to bring this attention to the attention of the UN Security Council, and try to address the issue there, because at the OPCW, it's just been impossible. So there have been a series of meetings under this mechanism called the ARIA formula, where the UN Security Council holds these sessions that are outside of normal meetings, but there's still a gathering of all the UN Security Council members, plus observer states who might get invited if they're relevant, like in this case Syria and Turkey. So I was invited by Russia and China to speak at one of these sessions, and my testimony is not very significant. All I did was recap my understanding of the story so far based on the leaked OPCW documents that have come out, the ones that were published by WikiLeaks, and documents that I've gotten myself, and as well as what other reporters have gotten. For example, Jonathan Steele, who wrote a really important article on this a year ago in Counterpunch. So I just summarized the story so far, and then and the asking the basic question was, why is the OPCW and the U.S., Britain, and France, which bombed Syria based on the chemical weapons allegations, why are they so devoted to these inspectors, to refusing to let them air the evidence that was suppressed? I think the answer is obvious, because because the evidence shows that this was not a chemical attack, and then accordingly, the OPCW was compromised to justify a U.S.-led bombing campaign. So the implications of this are massive, and that's why I think you see such a dedicated effort to silence the inspectors, to the point where, speaking alongside me at that meeting was also one of the inspectors, Ian Henderson. And, you have someone who's an actual OPCW scientist with actual credentials who conducted the actual Duma investigation. But yet not just the indifference towards him, but in fact the contempt that all the Western ambassadors displayed, calling him disgruntled and not having all the information. I mean, not engaging with the facts he lays out was just quite extraordinary. And that continued a week later at the UN Security Council, where at a full meeting of the UN Security Council inside the actual UN, Russia invited Jose Bustani, the former head of the OPCW, who was ousted 18 years ago because he stood in the way of the Iraq War. He was trying to bring Iraq into the Chemical Weapons Convention, and that would have been great for world peace, but it would have made it pretty impossible for the Bush administration to justify invading, because that would have meant that Iraq would have been subjected to inspections and and inspections of its chemical weapons stockpiles and even possibly destroying them if it were to enter into the convention. So Bustani was kicked out of the OPCW under U.S. pressure, even though his mandate had just been renewed. He was personally threatened by John Bolton, who told him, "We know where your kids live." So fast forward 18 years later, and Bustani gets indicted because he took part in a briefing that was held a year ago that was organized by the Courage Foundation, where one of the inspectors on the Doom investigation gave a personal briefing of how the investigation was censored and presented a lot of the evidence that was suppressed. And so Bustani was very concerned by this and signed on a petition in support of the inspectors. And what is so crazy about this is that these inspectors who were sidelined in this investigation, they're so experienced and so veteran at the OPCW that their tenure actually coincides with Bustani's 18 years ago, because they actually worked under him when he was the OPCW's first director general.
So they've been there, they've seen the whole thing.
They've been there for a long time. Yeah. And now both of them left for a bit and then came back. And the reason they came back is because they were, because they were experts and their expertise was in high need. Not everybody comes back for a second term. So
in one of the attacks at hand, they were actually on the ground in Syria when it happened, right?
Well, in one of the chemical attacks that happened in Syria, a OPCW inspection team was on the ground. That was Ghouta in August 2013. I don't know if these inspectors were there for that, but
gotcha.
One of the inspectors, Ian Henderson, he has deployed to Syria multiple times to take part in inspections, which he actually talked about in his session, because there's actually some relevant news that he broke in terms of the OPCW being used to put pressure on Syria and to lodge false allegations. He actually added some new details about what he witnessed in other inspections, but I don't know. I don't know actually if the inspectors have investigated
if these
previous
particular, but their colleagues were. Okay.
Yeah, but the point is that the U.S. and its allies voted to block Jose Bustani from testifying. So the scandal begins with the silencing of the inspectors, the silencing of their evidence, the silencing of their concerns when they try to raise them, refusing to meet with them. And now it continues with the silencing of the OPCW's own first leader, because he was coming to speak out in support of inspectors who he worked with. And he can attest to their level of integrity and expertise. And what's amazing is you have the U.S. and its allies voting to block a high-level official who headed the organization under discussion and try to find a mention of it in the media, in the U.S. media. It's just almost non-existent. The story, kind of like the issue itself, is it's being completely censored in Western media. And that to me is one of the craziest parts, that you just can't get people to pay attention to the story. And the reason is obvious, is because it's not just about an inter-OPCW dispute. It speaks to the core of the Syria proxy war narrative and all of the deceptions that were used to justify the billions of dollars that the U.S. and its allies spent waging a proxy war in Syria, with by staging deceptions like this, that we have to bomb Syria, we have to overthrow the government because it does things like this. It commits chemical weapons attacks, and now it's the alleged chemical weapons attacks are now being used to justify the murderous sanctions on Syria that deny Syrian kids food and medicine. So really, the reason why there's such a lockdown on the story is because for it to be considered and for it to be acknowledged, it would just undercut the core of the propaganda that is used to wage warfare on Syria, whether it's the form of bombs and sending in weapons and fighters during the proxy war, or now with an economic medieval siege.
Yeah, for sure. And I appreciate the way you cover this in a very professional way, but I'm just going to say, maybe it's unprofessional, but I was disgusted by the way the UN Security Council, the ambassadors to the various Western countries treated these people, because not only did they silence them, they tried to discredit them and smear them in the most petty ways that, from what I have witnessed, I just brushed these, they're advancing Russian disinformation. I mean, we've just been pounded with this for 4 years now. And I know of so many cases where it's just completely and totally disingenuous, and it's lazy too. And it just shows you, is that all they've got? Really? Is that all they can do? And I've also, one thing you mentioned is just the way that organizations are manipulated to advance this narrative, this all our overarching narrative that is apparently more important than anything else. And I've watched organizations whom I had respect for, one after the other, do things that I thought were really bad and lacked integrity, to advance this narrative, whether they caved and did this, or whether more likely they were pressured or undermined and manipulated. And really the defense of this is so weak. And also just everything I've seen in this war in Syria, maybe in history it won't be considered one of the most important wars or the great wars, but I think it is, for a lot of reasons and in what it exposed. And I think it was a turning point for this country, but that's just my own view. So I urge everyone to read Aaron's several articles on this and his colleagues, but especially listen to that Pushback episode that he did recently. It's titled OPCW Syria Whistleblower and Ex-Director Attacked by the US, UK, France at the UN, where he lays it all out and he gives you audio clips of the different members speaking and the witnesses, and really, it really done very well, and everything you need to know is kind of in there. So I'm going to come back to Syria in the bonus question, but let's talk about Russiagate for a little bit, because we have been talking about Russiagate for years, and as I said, in the past couple months, I haven't totally lost the plot on Russiagate, but I have not invested the time that you need to really stay up with the details and the daily intrigue. So there have been some reports issued. There have been documents released or leaked that seem kind of important. And, just the whole thing. We're leading up to the election now. The entire arc of this story may change significantly depending on who gets elected. And if you could just kind of catch us up on what has happened in Russiagate in the past couple of months. I know you did 2 big articles on the Senate report that was issued, the Senate Intelligence Committee report. And I'm not sure what you might have to say on some of the more recent developments.
Well, there's just been a continued attempt to keep the narrative going, to refuse to acknowledge that the Russia investigation was fundamentally a scam. And it's just amazing how the propaganda effort has been so strong that there is, even though there's so many damning revelations coming out constantly, it just doesn't make a dent in the narrative. It's hard to know where to begin. There, and it's these things get attention for a week or two, and they're treated as the biggest bombshell in the world, and then they go away because they're actually, deep down, everyone knows that it's all just propaganda, that it's all talk. So, for example, in August, you had that Senate intelligence report, and that was treated as like finally, yes, now the Russia investigation was valid, and it was treated as the investigation that Mueller failed to do. There's been this huge effort to now throw Mueller under the bus.
Oh my God!
But by the same people who used to worship him and then tell us that he was going to bring Trump out of the White House in handcuffs, and he was this hero. He was this mythic figure. And then it turned out when he spoke about his investigation that he didn't have a basic grasp of it, which was just so sad, but also so perfectly telling of the fantasy that Russiagate was. And so the Senate intelligence report claimed, the big headline was that Konstantin Kilimnik, this longtime associate of Paul Manafort, that he was really a secret Russian intelligence officer. And they tried to recycle this old conspiracy theory that Kilimnik got sensitive polling data from Manafort, and then he might have passed that on to Russia for their sweeping interference operation. I mean, even if you accept for a second this view, and it's only a view, that Kilimnik is really a Russian spy, the idea that he could use this polling data for something is just so laughable. Like, for what? For these Russian ads that weren't even about the election and didn't even, and most of them didn't even air until after the election. It's just farcical. But then you look at the actual allegation itself, and it's just, this, what the Senate did, just like Mueller, is they ignored so much documentation that Kilimnik was actually a sensitive source giving information to the U.S. Embassy in Ukraine, that when he and Paul Manafort were working in Ukraine, they were not working, on behalf of so-called Russian interests. They were trying to move Russia out of Ukraine and push Ukraine into the Western orbit, which was the U.S. policy at the time. Like, that was their attempt, and they failed. But all that gets ignored to paint this narrative. And, in terms of why it happened, I think it just speaks the same reason why Maria Butina was indicted and prosecuted, and we were told for a long time that she was a Russian honeypot spy, as possibly a part of this grand Russian scheme connecting the NRA to Russia and Trump and all this crazy stuff. It's because they need a Russian to get to justify the narrative. They need a Russian, and of course, the irony in Kilimnik's case is that he's actually born in Ukraine. He's a citizen of both countries, and he is a guy who's actually been the bulk of his career has been working in support of U.S. government interests inside Ukraine. He was the head of the Moscow office of the International Republican Institute, which is a U.S. government organization. John McCain was the president for a long time. He worked there, and then he worked for Paul Manafort in Ukraine. And as I said, having regular meetings with U.S. officials. He even served as a translator in a meeting with Victoria Nuland back when she was trying to overthrow the Ukrainian government. So, yet the Senate Intelligence Committee raises no concerns about any of that, because it sort of barely acknowledges it, and instead tries to make this thing about him being a Russian spy. But look, it's ridiculous, and it's a part of a pattern where Mueller didn't try to interview Kilimnik, just as Mueller also didn't try to interview Assange, and the Senate also didn't try to interview Kilimnik either. And what they did was they just cowardly accused him of being a spy. They redacted all the information that they say substantiates their belief. And what they do include is just ridiculous. Like in the section where they try to substantiate why he's a spy, they include the fact that he sent an email where they say that he denied Russian election interference. Okay, so even if he did do that, is that an evidence that he's a Russian spy because he sends an email denying Russian election interference? And then you look at the footnote, and what it is that Kilimnik emailed a Financial Times article to his colleague, this guy Sam Patton, and made a joke about how the U.S. government, how the Mueller team or the FBI are looking for Russians everywhere. So like that's their evidence that he's a Russian spy. It's just so farcical, but yet no one takes a second to actually look at what the evidence is.
The actual thing.
They see a declaration that fits a convenient narrative that helps people, justify the fact that they bought onto this stupid thing for 4 years, and they go with it. And but that faded away because, of course, it's there's nothing actually damning there because it's all supposition, innuendo, and redacted supposition and innuendo. And then we move on to then we learn recently that the FBI very early on interviewed Christopher Steele's primary subsource, and they realized that the Steele dossier was entirely fiction. This was in January 2017, but yet they still got FISA warrants based on the Steele dossier, and they still continued to tell the public that they were investigating it and that it was credible and blah, blah, blah. So, you just have more and more evidence of fraud and deception being used to carry out Russiagate, which makes sense because the whole thing was a scam. And another recent development was you have some notes declassified saying that U.S. intelligence had picked up word that the Clinton campaign was trying to frame Trump and tie him to Russia somehow. And that was treated as some big revelation. But to me, that was just like we already know that because
That was
they
an
they had,
underlying thing all along. Yeah.
well, yeah, I mean, like they literally hired Fusion GPS and got Christopher Steele to write up those moronic, um, those moronic dossier briefings about a high-level Trump-Russia conspiracy. So, um, I my only, the one word of caution I'd advise people is I think, people are expecting indictments and all this stuff, and I don't doubt that there was some. I wouldn't be surprised if there was criminal behavior in perpetuating Russiagate. But the thing is, I think also the people who pulled this off are not stupid, and I think that the most damning documents are the ones that we're never going to see because I would
Yes.
imagine that a lot of them have been destroyed. I mean, for example, like what I really care about is given how so much of this, so much of this has been shown to be a documented fraud so far. So collusion, that's a fraud, and the Russian the fear mongering about Russian social media ads, that's also a fraud, and it actually began with Democratic staffers who actually spread this theory around to Capitol Hill, which then brought it to Facebook, and then Facebook, under pressure, all of a sudden came out with this thing about Russian ads. So there's every single case you can look at a partisan tie and a fraud. But I'm most concerned now with the underlying issue, which is the emails. Who stole the emails? And that also comes from a partisan entity with deep conflicts of interest, which is CrowdStrike, the private firm that first accused Russia of stealing the emails. They're the ones who first made that allegation. And the US government did rely on CrowdStrike's forensics, not entirely, but at least in large part. And we learned recently that behind closed doors, the president of CrowdStrike, Sean Henry, actually told lawmakers that CrowdStrike had no evidence that anything was exfiltrated by these alleged Russian hackers off the server, which raises the obvious question. If you can't show any evidence of these emails being stolen, then why are you so confidently accusing Russia of stealing them? But of course, we didn't learn that until this year, when really he said that behind closed doors in December 2017. But in terms of evidence there, I'd like to see the release of the evidence that was used to make the attribution to Russia. What has been shown to us has a lot of holes. And but the thing is, if there was fraud there, I just don't think we'll ever know it. So, for example, if Guccifer 2.0 was a fraud, they say that's like the U.S. government says that was really a Russian intelligence cutout. Well, if Guccifer 2.0 is not that, and if it was someone trying to pretend to be a Russian intelligence cutout, we'll never learn that unless somebody speaks out, unless we get like a whistleblower like we've never seen before. So, in terms of people's expectations for documents and all this stuff, I suspect that if there really was something criminal, then the evidence of that will have already been destroyed and we'll never see it.
Mm. Oh, I think it was criminal. I think it was so hugely criminal. It's going to be, and the highest level people are never held to account. Our government's idea of holding people, very, very powerful people, accountable is bringing them in front of generally a Senate committee and scolding them a little bit, and that's their punishment. I saw it with Wall Street. I'm seeing it with Russiagate. But for right now, one of the most important things, their task, certainly the Senate intelligence, but even the media and things like that, is to, in my view, to show that it was justified. The whole thing, the whole investigation itself was justified. It was legitimate because, and I think that indicates where the real crime is, that it never was, that it was a complete manipulation of the awesome powers of, the state apparatus in the United States were used just in a completely fraudulent way, which I think there are so many crimes. That's why
Yeah,
we're
and the
not
thing
going to
is,
see it.
right, and the problem is right now is that it's hard to get, people, except for diehard Trump fans, to really care. And I understand why, is because, people want to see Trump defeated. I mean, so do I. I really hope he loses. But what people don't see is that by going along with this, by letting all this happen and not criticizing it, and not pointing out that it's wrong. I mean, even though we don't like Trump, it's wrong for the U.S. intelligence services to be weaponized to interfere in domestic politics, and with huge consequences and deliberate consequences. Because I think one of the aims here was to further poison U.S.-Russia relations, because Trump was calling for having better ties with Russia.
Yeah.
So a great way to undermine that is to criminalize diplomacy with Russia, as Stephen Cohen often pointed out, and to accuse Trump of being a Kremlin agent, which helps further stigmatize Russia and makes it more difficult to deal with it, and also and B, it also encourages Trump, who doesn't really have any real convictions, to be even more hawkish with Russia than he otherwise would. And that's what's happened. His policies have been way more hawkish on Russia than even Obama's were. And Obama was pretty hawkish, I think. But at least there were a couple of positive things, like the New START treaty, a major treaty limiting the nuclear weapon stockpiles of both countries. I mean, who can be against that? But look what Trump's done. Trump is about to kill that treaty, it looks like. He certainly refused to renew it, which is just crazy. But, Russiagate has helped incentivize him to be hawkish, and Democrats have chosen to challenge him from the right on it, which has just led to a total disaster. But so that's just one consequence. And even if it helps, even if, no one cares now, and, and even if it's totally unfair that it happened to Trump, I mean, the fact is, if we co-sign it now and we don't speak out against it, that same playbook will be used against somebody else in the future, and somebody else who maybe actually will be a genuine peace candidate and a genuine anti-war candidate, unlike Trump, who was he had his finger on the pulse. He saw that saying some anti-war things had some electoral benefit, so he said it. But what if there's a genuine peace, pro-détente candidate in the future? Does anybody believe that this will not be used against them as well in the future? I mean, so what's been established here by using this against Trump has very dangerous implications for the future.
Yeah, that's the fundamental thing. And for me, it seems like it always does. The bad things, the ways that powers are weaponized, institutional powers are weaponized, they're used against, terrible bad guys that everyone hates. But it always comes around to be used against particularly dissidents. And, if you can't see that, I have a hard time having any respect for your judgment. You know what I mean? Not you personally, Aaron. I mean, you in the bigger sense. But
yeah, and it's also just a matter, it's also just a thing of, if we don't want to be complete hypocrites, then we have to apply to we have to apply to ourselves the same standards that we hold up for others. And so, if people see this happening to Trump and they think it's okay because it's Trump and Trump is awful, which he is, then you're just a complete hypocrite, and it means you're establishing a precedent in which things can be used against you disingenuously and very harmfully in the future, such as weaponizing intelligence services. It's like it's the opposite of what a democracy should be, and it's just so weird how many people go along with it. I mean, I don't blame people in the public, because they've been presented with such a one-sided narrative about Russiagate, where there's been such a dedicated propaganda effort to really make people believe that there's something to it, and that, we should fear Russian interference and all this fear-mongering. But the people in media whose job it is to, distinguish facts from propaganda, but who've gone along with the propaganda, it's been crazy. And it's a lot of people don't realize that causes that they believe in are one day going to be targeted with the same playbook that they cheered throughout Russiagate.
Exactly. Now, how much time do you have left, Aaron?
I got about, I can talk for 20 more minutes. How about that?
Okay, that'll work.
Okay.
Perfect. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Stephen Cohen, because these are the kinds of things, these bigger impacts, broader impacts. These are the kinds of things that he's been talking about that genuinely bothered him, worried him, kept him up at night. And he pointed these things out all along the way, starting And I will say all the way back since 2014 when I first started to listen to him.
That's right.
And, I'm personally devastated by his death. And I
Yeah.
didn't even know him. And, frankly, by the way he was treated during the past 4 years.
Yeah.
So, and I didn't even know him personally, like you did. I listened to every interview with him that I could find because
Yep.
he was one of the top people and one of the few people that I thought was genuine, well reasoned, and had integrity in this. In 2014, I was closely following the Euromaidan in Ukraine, and I was lost. I knew very little about Ukraine, even about Russia, and I was frustrated that there wasn't more analysis in English language. There's a lot of information if you could speak Russian,
Yeah.
but because the people in the eastern Ukraine, mostly speak Russian. So,
Yep.
and when I found Stephen Cohen, I asked his wife, Katrina, editor of The Nation, where you also work, where to find more writings and interviews for him. And she told me, Steve does a weekly discussion with John Batchelor on a New York
Yeah.
City radio station.
Yeah.
And they weren't generally aligned politically all the time, but they got along very well and they had common ground on this. And they did a really good job, a really excellent job. It should be, and actually, Steve did kind of chronicle all that in his book. But so anyway, I started listening weekly in real time, and basically I never stopped after that.
Yep.
I regret that I wasn't able to interview him. The first time I asked for an interview, he was in the middle of publishing his book and said he was just swamped. I don't know if you remember, I'd asked you for help in contacting him, and I did contact him. And I tried one more time, like a year or so later, and he was very friendly, very warm. But I got a shorter response this time saying that he simply couldn't do it. And I actually, at the time, I thought it might have been like a gentle brush off, and maybe it was. But I know he's selective in his interviews. But now I realize that he was probably very sick at that time. And it's just, I'm still grieving this man who I never knew except through, a few very short correspondences. But one who taught me and a lot of other people who were willing to listen, so much.
Mm-hmm.
And while it may sound strange, it's kind of hard to explain. But while people like Stephen Cohen were around, I had some hope for sanity in our foreign policy.
Yep.
And so I'm not only grieving the loss of a man who I respected, but also his voice and influence and the ability to challenge like the worst of our war and foreign policy establishment. So I know that you're still grieving him, and I was wondering if you could offer some thoughts. And also, I know he was very fond of you and your work. And I wondered maybe he gave you some advice or guidance, before his death, or to be fair, if you're willing to share any of that, I'd love to hear it.
Well, I think you said it all. I mean, his importance is incalculable, and he can never be replaced. There will never be anyone to get to that level of prestige in the academy and in the intelligentsia on this issue of Russia with that level of knowledge and integrity. There just won't be. They won't allow it ever again, and I'm not even sure if anyone else is capable of it, because he was so just uniquely brilliant and such a student of Russia, who lived Russian history, who actually changed it a little bit. He was his work on the Soviet Union helped change people's understanding of Soviet history, and it's credited with even leading to opening up a little bit of Soviet intellectual culture in ways that hadn't happened before. And what you say about his importance, especially after Ukraine, I mean, it's interesting. I also didn't know much about Ukraine. I didn't follow it closely, and I remember buying into a lot of the conventional propaganda at the time. Even though I'm someone I'm a lifelong leftist, I consider I've always been skeptical of the dominant narrative. But it's just amazing how powerful our propaganda system is, that even someone like myself, who considers himself informed and adversarial, I just remember getting duped. But then I heard Stephen Cohen, and I realized, okay, oh yeah, this guy's totally right.
Exactly.
This whole thing is like a continuation of the Cold War, basically. And I met him I learned of him because I worked at Democracy Now! For over a decade, and we used to interview him all the time. And actually, I was co-hosting an interview with him it must have been 2014. And you see me kind of pose to him some questions that are very just like, you know, parroting the conventional line. And his response, and I remember the way he was responding, I was like, oh my God, I've been a dupe. I've been a complete dupe. And so anyway, after that, I just, I like you, read everything I could of his. And I also listened to his weekly John Batchelor discussions, which were so important. And especially during, Russiagate mania, especially in the early stages,
Mm-hmm.
like those weekly sessions, those weekly interviews were like just an oasis of sanity and
Exactly.
and facts. Steve would just correct all the predominant propaganda of that week, especially on Ukraine, which was, like Rushgate was also used to help, whitewash that whole thing completely, right through the impeachment of Trump. And Steve would just offer a sober, informed corrective every single week, and his sanity, like you, it gave me some hope because everybody else was being so just so caught up in all this stuff. And the point that really illustrates how warped our culture got and how difficult it must have been for Steve during this time was that, Democracy Now!, which is like for a long time sort of like the like the conscience, I think, of progressive media, and really like the standard bearer for progressive media. I know it wasn't perfect, but I was very proud of it when I was there. I really felt as if we consistently made an effort to, push back on prevailing narratives, and to, even if we made a mistake, to correct it and try to, give voice to the facts and to dissenting opinions. After early 2017, even though Steve was a regular guest there forever, they never let him on after that, after April 2017. So in the last 3 years of his life, he never even appeared. He wasn't even allowed on Democracy Now!, which is just such an embarrassment for our, I don't just blame DN. It's like, it's an indictment of our media culture overall, that, Russophobia was so prevalent and Russiagate was so strong that someone as wise and brilliant as Stephen Cohen was deemed, off limits, and he was marginalized. And that was, the result of a dedicated smear campaign against him by his enemies who couldn't challenge him on the facts. And you see that every time he debates someone. Like, there's this great clip of him debating Max Boot on CNN, and Max Boot calls him an apologist for Russia, and Steve just so effortlessly
shredded
and graciously destroys him. So that was Steve. And in terms of advice he shared with me, he the one, when I'd ask him like whether all this bothered him, the fact that, all the places that had once welcomed him were shunning him. I remember, like, this is like a guy who was like, he was an analyst on CBS News. He covered Cold War summits with Dan Rather. He was a professor emeritus at two top schools, NYU and Princeton, revered scholar. And then to see him being called like a Putin apologist and just dismissed and attacked and all this stuff, I asked him if it bothered him, and it did bother him. It did. He was honest about that, but he also said, you know what? At the end, what do I care? I have great health care. What can they do to me? And I'm not going to be intimidated by smear campaigns. He was just, ultimately, his fidelity was to facts and to principles of peace and cooperation between, these two countries. And he stuck to it. And what he said to me was just things like, no matter what they say about us, our merry little band of Russiagate skeptics, whatever you want to call us, we continue our work. It doesn't matter what they say, because, our commitment is to facts and to try to educating people with what the truth is. And I really took that to heart. And I will obviously continue to take it to heart going forward. But it's just, as you say, it's so hard doing it without him, because not a day passes when something happens. And I think, God, I wish Steve was here to tell us like what his take is on this, because he he was so informed and so brilliant, and had such a deep historical knowledge to help give us the background to understand what is happening today.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not even going to try to add anything to that because, you've said it, and it's a terrible loss. I got one bonus question for you, Aaron, but it's got multiple parts to wrap this up. And rest in peace, Stephen Cohen. You've done great work, and I've learned so much from you. And it is going to be, like Aaron said, it's going to be difficult doing this without you around. Okay, so the bonus question. I'm going to swing back to Syria and the OPCW. It's a multi-part question. So the first part is, and I think you actually covered this, is how did the whistleblower documents, getting through, or information getting through to Grayzone, how did that come about, as much of it as you can say? And from what you've been able to gather, so it's clear that there's enormous pressure on OPCW to manipulate or suppress whatever needs to be manipulated or suppressed to advance the narrative about chemical weapons, which is an underlying premise for our involvement in Syria, for our push to change their leadership and God only knows what else to that country. Were there specific people applying the pressure, and what interests were they representing, and what are their overall goals from what you've been able to learn from it? And I guess the last part is, I watched this in real time. It was a pattern. It was a big warning by the U.S. government, sometimes from the Europeans, like, you guys better not use chemical weapons, because if you do, we might have to intervene militarily. And it was like a signal to the proxy jihadists. It seemed like it was a trigger for them to go ahead and do something or stage something, and it would happen over and over and over again. And the tactic never seemed to really work, but they kept doing it over and over again. And in later on, they were generating some pushback, and I think a lot of people were skeptical, despite the concrete media narrative that never changed. And by the way, Grayzone has some more on that too, on where the money was coming from for that media coordination, contractors and such, which is another topic. We'd need like 5 hours to get all the relevant information on the things that Aaron's working on. So that's the bonus question, Aaron. Multi-part, who's pushing on this? What are their goals? Based on what you've learned from this whole process. The answer to the bonus question is in the bonus segment for patrons. You can get access to bonus segments. There's one for almost every interview by subscribing at Patreon. Plus, you get access to other episodes that are for patrons only, to our new Discord channel where we can talk among ourselves and do some Q&A live streams and such. So that's my tease. I hope some of you will join us. And now I'll continue with the interview wrap-up. All right, well, I got to let you go. Best way to support your work?
Well, if you like Pushback, the show I host, you can support it at Patreon. Thanks, Joanne. I always appreciate the opportunity to speak to you, so thank you.
You too, Aaron. Thanks so much. Thank you for listening. Special thanks to Aaron Maté. Follow Aaron on Twitter at Aaron J. Maté. Subscribe to his show, Pushback, at the Grayzone channel on YouTube, and support him on Patreon. This podcast is independent media, so listener support is important. Patreon.com/AroundTheEmpire or PayPal.me/AroundTheEmpirePod. You can find this podcast on any mobile podcast app, at the website AroundTheEmpire.com, on Patreon, or on YouTube. And if you're listening on YouTube, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Follow on Twitter at Around the Empire, and we'll see you next time. Take care, everybody.